Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Hi, Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
All right. Well, we're here to talk about one of the most unique facets of American culture, and that is lawsuits. You are a professor at the University of Georgia School of Law and author of The Pain Brokers: How Con Men, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. I think most of us are familiar with personal injury attorneys. We've all been involved in class action lawsuits, whether we wanted to or not. And this book touches on mass torts. Can you describe the difference between the three?
Sure. So, well, first of all, let me back up a little bit and just talk about a tort because not everybody knows what that is. A tort is a harm. It's like a punch, a kick, a car accident. When we're talking about personal injury cases, we're talking about bodily harm that happens to someone in some way. So it might be through a car accident, which is what we're probably most familiar with. But it could also be through what I think of as a mass tort, which is a type of harm that happens to people on a very large scale. I'm sure you've heard of them, even if you think you haven't. So the opioid lawsuits are an example. The BP oil spill is an example. But also anytime someone is hurt through a medical device in similar ways, many people are harmed in that way. And that's what we think of as a mass tort. It's something that really calls out for some sort of centralized resolution in the federal courts, which is a whole different type of procedure than even a class action. So, we all get those notices in the mail for class actions, but class actions tend to be, hey, I was overcharged $3 at the ATM. It's not something that I care deeply about. No lawyer is going to take a case for just $3. So the class actions are what typically make those types of cases viable cases. Mass torts are different because they are bodily injuries. These are life-changing injuries to people who are deeply affected.
Okay. So the difference between a class action lawsuit, I got one from a bank, again, overcharged some fees. If you were a customer between such and such dates, you may be, and you fill out this paperwork and you'll hear back a half a year later and ask to fill out some more paperwork. And then a year later, after you've forgotten about it, you get a check in the mail for $8.72. Is the difference between the class action that it is not to do with bodily harm and mass torts or are there further distinctions there?
So there are a lot of differences. It is conceivable that you could certify a mass tort as a class action. In general, for class actions, the commonalities in a lawsuit have to overwhelm the individualities in a lawsuit. So typically speaking, we have class actions over things like employment discrimination or patent cases or securities class actions or consumer fraud types of cases. But generally speaking, there's a whole rigid set of rules that you have to jump through, hurdles and hoops, and frankly, procedural safeguards for class actions that you don't have in mass torts. So, I think about mass torts as almost like the Wild West of litigation, which is concerning because we have so many mass torts. Way back in 2023, 1 out of every 2 lawsuits that was filed in federal civil court was part of a mass tort. That has waned somewhat as some of these big cases has resolved. But in large part, people who are entering the court system today are very likely to do so through these types of cases.
And my understanding also with a class action lawsuit is everybody gets the same amount, whereas in a mass tort, some people can get more than others.
Yeah, so class actions can differ as well. But again, because mass torts are based on bodily harm, people can be harmed in different ways. And the defendants, the big corporations, have to take you as they find you. So, if I were to take a particular type of drug and I was more affected because of some sort of brain chemistry that I have, then I have to be compensated as my damages suggest that I should be compensated. So it doesn't always work perfectly. And as we'll talk about in mass torts, it can work very imperfectly. But in general, you're supposed to get compensation for the harm that you've suffered.
And I think imperfectly may be too small of a word for what we'll get into. And there has been a lot of opposition, I think, and you talk a little bit about this in describing, and maybe if you could describe the case that you mentioned in your book, the hot coffee documentary, which featured Stella Liebeck.
Yeah. Yeah, so the hot coffee case really came to us in the 1980s, 1990s as tort reform was really getting underway, and, there was even a Seinfeld episode about it back in the day,
Wow.
and the headline was, "Woman suing over coffee that burned her in her lap. It's too hot," right? How ridiculous is this that these people are suing because they get hot coffee that is in fact hot? But the reality behind it is very, very different. So Stella Liebeck wasn't driving her car when she went through McDonald's. She was in the passenger seat. Her younger nephew was driving. They pulled over to the side so that she could get all of her coffee situated, get the creamer and whatnot put in. And the coffee was so hot it tipped over and spilled into her lap. It burned through her sweatpants. She suffered third-degree burns. She had to have multiple reconstructive surgeries. And so, what's often sort of cast off is, oh, look at this ridiculous headline. When you dig in, it turns out that it is very much a serious injury. And so when we think about tort reform, people want us to think about these so called silly lawsuits when they, in fact, aren't so silly after all.
And so, I mean, that basically became the poster child.
Yeah, absolutely. It became the poster child for tort reform. Tort reform is kind of the umbrella term for a variety of things. It's putting caps on damages like non economic damages, so pain and suffering. So anything really above your medical bills is what we think of as pain and suffering. Punitive damages. So it turned out that McDonald's had a number of these reports with hot coffee, but they persisted at putting the coffee at over 200 degrees, which will burn you instantly if it touches your skin. So it's designed to punish companies and to try to deter them from this kind of conduct that happens in the future. And it also includes a number of other things that, in other words, trying to get rid of class actions, trying to make class actions harder to certify, et cetera.
And that is considered, and I guess it's often been Republican administrations that have tried to change these laws, and basically siding with corporate interests. So what is the thought process behind that?
Well, I think so. The impetus behind tort reform is to make it harder to sue. It's spearheaded by typically the US Chamber of Commerce, which is made up of huge companies like Philip Morris and Walmart and, everything from big tobacco to big pharma, again, to try to make it more difficult for the average American to get into court.
All right. And you had mentioned, I guess, early in the book, and I wanted to talk about the Johnson and Johnson Propulsid lawsuit, which Propulsid is an acid reflux medication, and you had given a speech at Duke, and maybe you can describe a little bit about that case and the outcome there.
Yeah, so this was actually based on my academic work a number of years ago. I started doing an empirical study on these types of mass tort cases to see how they got resolved. And Johnson and Johnson manufactured a drug called Propulsid. It was meant to deal with acid reflux. There were allegations that it also caused all kinds of different heart issues and cardiac arrhythmias, et cetera. It was being used off label in children when it provided no value for children. So there were a number of lawsuits over Propulsid. What I was interested in was how these got resolved. And it turned out when you dig into all the details, if you're if you're into legalese, then pull up one of these settlements because they're 200 plus pages of very dense legalese. I dug into it, and what I found is that the lead plaintiff's attorneys were paid $22 million by Johnson and Johnson in what's called common benefit fees, so fees that they get for representing the group as a whole, in return for putting plaintiffs into a process that looks a lot like arbitration. It's this kind of alternative dispute resolution process, meaning you give up your right to sue in court, you go into this process. The process was in front of three medical doctors. So you can imagine a plaintiff's lawyer willingly putting your case in front of three doctors as opposed to a jury of your peers. So out of over 6,000 some odd plaintiffs who went through this process, only a handful recovered. I think it was 32, if I'm guessing off the top of my head, and they collectively recovered less than $6.5 million. So you've got Johnson and Johnson paying the attorneys $22 million, the people that they're supposed to represent getting a fraction of that. And it really sort of kicked off a concern, a long sort of standing concern that we're worried that the lawyers are benefiting at the expense of the people that they're supposed to be representing.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, it is, of course, the old stereotype that the lawyers get all the money, and in this case, yeah, they got 3 times the amount of the people who were actually victims.
Right. And,
And
yeah, I just wanna mention, like, there are so many good plaintiffs' lawyers. Plaintiffs' lawyers do good work in the world, and, we worry about tort reform, but in this instance, there are and then the instances in the pain brokers, there are a lot of people out there who are unscrupulous.
right, right, and so, have there been any changes since that case? Has anything no.
Not a thing, unfortunately, which is the frustration that frankly led me to get an MFA in narrative nonfiction and write The Pain Brokers.
Excellent. Well, and before we jump into this case, can you describe the difference between a lawsuit and arbitration? Because I think most of us, and we've all signed these terms and conditions on the internet that nobody reads. I mean, I can only speak for myself. You're a lawyer, maybe you have, but basically that bind us to arbitration. So
Yeah.
what is it?
Yeah. So it's funny, I always ask my first year students in law school to raise their hand if they've signed an arbitration agreement, and nobody does. And I said, "Oh, well, none of you have a credit card? None of you have a cell phone? None of you have a computer with software? Nothing?" And they're like, "Oh,
You've
well, I guess
signed
I."
multiple,
But, pretty
probably
much
10 or more.
yeah. So arbitration is a procedure that takes proceedings out of the court system. It puts them in front of a private arbitrator, which is someone that either you have to pay for or the company that you're suing has to pay for. And there have been a number of studies, particularly in the consumer arbitration context, that show that these arbitrators, if they rule too heavily in favor of consumers, then the companies that create these arbitration agreements are no longer going to employ them. So it's thought oftentimes to be a pretty one-sided procedure because, they're being employed, they're being paid for oftentimes by the corporations who are designing the arbitration agreements. The rules that we think about in court don't apply. So it's kind of like you look at all these rules that you have in the court system and it's like a la carte menu. Hey, I don't want discovery here. I don't want these rules of evidence. So it's really a procedure that is designed in favor of the companies that are creating them.
And what does discovery mean in legal context?
Yeah, so discovery means digging up dirt on the other side, right? If you were to sue me, you would want to find out everything that I know about your side of the case. And so discovery is the mechanism by which we do that through asking people questions under oath, which is a deposition, or asking them to produce documents through request to produce. That's all part of the discovery process.
And when you are and just so people understand, when people are communicating with a lawyer that's considered privileged communication, attorney-client privilege, any of those communications are considered non-discoverable, is that correct?
They are supposed to be. I mean, if you are talking to your lawyer and it's just your lawyer in the room and you are providing them information that you are giving to them in confidence, then it is not discoverable. Now, that doesn't mean that the underlying facts aren't discoverable. So if I am in furtherance of a crime and then I'm telling my lawyer where I hid the body, like the facts themselves can be discoverable. It's just the communications that are provided to your lawyer about how they are creating your defense and, your strategy, et cetera.
So maybe we can get into the mesh case, and I don't quite know what to call it, but I'll let you take the lead from here.
Yeah, so pelvic mesh, this is, it's one of those devices nobody really likes to talk about because it deals with vaginas and incontinence, right? It's not exactly something that we put on TV on a regular basis, but
Yeah.
for a number of years, pelvic mesh was used to deal with pelvic organ prolapse. So, as women age, faces sag, other things sag, internal organs sag. And mesh was designed to be kind of like a supportive hammock that keeps things in place and helps to prevent incontinence as well as prolapse. It was invented in part after hernia mesh. So, a hernia mesh was very popular in men's abdomens. Why not try it out in the vagina? Turns out those are two very, very different areas. Not that there aren't problems with hernia mesh as well, but pelvic mesh in particular was deeply problematic. It wasn't tested in patients before it was put on the market. It was put through the FDA through kind of a backdoor process. So, since the FDA had approved the use in hernias, then there there didn't have to be independent testing in
I
women.
see.
And so what happened in a lot of cases, but not all of them, mesh is designed, sort of go in, it's like a plastic weave. If you're picturing a friendship bracelet made out of fishing line, that's kind of a little bit what it looks like. And it's supposed to form scar tissue. The tissue is supposed to, form scar tissue around it and perform that kind of protective function. It's meant to go in, it's never meant to go out. It's kind of like putting rebar in concrete. And so it turns out that it also can unravel. So in many cases, it was unraveling, it was causing pain, it was piercing other parts of the body, different internal organs. And in a number of cases, it did ultimately have to be removed.
Wow. And I should note that I once had a hernia, which was repaired, and the surgeon had offered mesh, and I politely declined, given that it was a small operation, and he said afterwards that I didn't need it, but I did hear years later that there were concerns with the, abdominal mesh as well. So this kinda hits home for me, certainly not in the same way that it affected these women, but I understand what it is, and, putting a foreign object in your body is always cause for concern.
Right. Right.
And so there were a number of cases that had come out that women were having issues with this mesh, and so it created, I guess, this free for all and these unscrupulous characters to basically find women who maybe didn't have any concerns with the product and make them think that they did. Can you kinda describe the operation there?
Yeah. So behind the scenes, there was a feeding frenzy taking place. And well, let me just sort of put you in their shoes. So imagine that you were in your kitchen, you get a phone call at night. It's not a number that you recognize. Maybe you don't answer and it goes to voicemail, but it's either the voicemail or a live person that you're dealing with. And they know an inordinate amount of information about you. They know your name, they know your birth date, they know the date that you had mesh implanted, they know the name of your doctor, the name of your hospital. So suddenly they're sounding very, very legitimate. And then they tell you, you have a ticking time bomb in you. If you don't have this removed immediately, then you are going to die. And so you can imagine, right? You can imagine you get these phone calls, and there were a number of objections raised saying, oh, well, I've got to talk to my doctor. They would say, well, do you trust your doctor? And for a lot of these women who were experiencing some of their pains, they felt like their doctors had been very dismissive of the pain.
Yeah.
For those who did trust their doctors, then the callers would say, well, this is something that is on the cutting edge. Not many doctors know that this is happening. We have a few doctors in the country who can fix this. We're going to hook you up with them. They're the only ones who can do it. Don't worry, we're setting up appointments in 2 weeks. We're going to fly you down to South Florida and we're going to take care of everything. So some of the women actually thought that it was the medical device manufacturer themselves that were calling them. So you can imagine, you get one of those postcards in the mail that says, hey, we need to fix the sun visor on your car. Bring it by the shop. We'll fix it for you. They thought this was something similar. But instead, these phone calls came from a data breach in India when private health insurance companies started outsourcing their medical records keeping to India. Some of those Indian call centers realized they were sitting on a gold mine, and they teamed up with
See.
this outfit down in South Florida. And I'm happy to talk about some of those villains because they're, kind
Oh,
of the
please, please.
most villainous villains you can imagine.
Oh, they're great. I mean, some of them right out of Central Casting. I'm, looking up their picture and I'm like, "Yeah, it's exactly what I thought this guy would look like."
Yeah, I'll start with Vince Chabra. Vincent Chabra went to prison in the early 2000s for running an online pill mill. He got out and then was sent back to prison for running a puppy mill, which also required prescription medicines, which violated his probation. When he got out a second time, he had to go bury his father back in his native India. And when taking his father's ashes to India, he reconnected with some of his cousins who were running this call center. And they said, boy, do we have a thing for you, and he had been running, he'd been selling leads for solar panels, for dental exams, but they talked about these mass tort leads. And they said, if you could just find a mass tort lead, the margins are incredible. And so he found a lawyer in the United States and paired up with him. And eventually, his son, as sort of his front man, created their own law firm called Alpha Law. Now, mind you, that Vincent is not a lawyer. His son, who was in his early 20s at the time, also not a lawyer. But DC has this sort of weird loophole. I assume it was created for lobbyists so that lobbyists could cozy up with lawyers, where non lawyers can form law firms with lawyers. So
No
they
idea.
created this company called Alpha Law. They began cold calling these people. Enter in some of these other characters. There's Blake Barber. He's this 6 foot plus tall, hulking figure. He dresses somewhere between a Hell's Angel and a skater. He's got this flamingo pink goatee. He sometimes dyes it Smurf blue, sometimes, like St. Patrick's green. He desperately wants a capuchin monkey as a pet, and he is the middleman. He's the go-between who is creating all of the flights for these women and coordinating travel for the women. He runs an outfit called Surgical Assistants. And so we've got them, and then we've got Ron LaSorsa, who is one of the other kind of kingpins in all of this, who ultimately became my whistleblower in this. And so he's a former Marine. He was a company commander in the Marines for a number of years. He got out. He went to Wall Street, was making a ton of money on Wall Street, ended up leaving Wall Street and hooking up with Vince Chabra and then running this outfit, 1000 Corporate Drive, which is a sky high mirrored building that it looks and as plastic as it sounds. So
And
it's kind of right
Fort
off
Lauderdale based.
in
Most
Fort
of this
Lauderdale.
stuff is South Florida based.
Most is South Florida. Yeah.
And so there's this concept of litigation funding. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So part of this was to get people who did not have access to medical care, or so they claimed, to sign up with third party litigation funders. Now, all the people that I spoke with had insurance or they had access to Medicaid or Medicare. But the deal was that, after you got these phone calls that scared you to death and told you that you had a ticking time bomb in you, then they sent you a DocuSign packet. Now, the DocuSign packet was programmed to take you straight to the signature page, and then it auto-populated your signature and your initials throughout all the pages as if you had actually read them. So people got a DocuSign packet before surgery. They assumed it was a HIPAA form, health consent forms, the typical things that you would sign. They did not realize that contained within there was a attorney-client retainer agreement that includes that arbitration provision that we talked about. In addition to the attorney-client retainer agreement, there was a lien. Now, this lien was for medical funding. So a procedure that, had they used their insurance, would have cost them somewhere between $800 and $1,000, paid mostly for by insurance, cost them between $69,000 and $120,000 as a lien against their future settlement proceeds. Now, bear in mind that the average mesh settlement was only $40,000, which is bananas in and of itself. So there was a settlement for hip implants about a decade earlier. And if you had a hip implant, you got $200,000. So
Wow.
why your hip is worth more than a vagina, is a
Doesn't
good
make sense.
question.
Yeah.
But when the settlement proceeds didn't cover the entire amount, then sometimes these litigation funders actually went after the women for the remainder of the amount.
So in other words, they won either way. Even if the lawsuit failed, they're still on these women were on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars that they needed to then reimburse these companies that they had no idea that they were signing up for. And just for folks who haven't done a DocuSign, and I've done quite a few of them, yeah, I mean, you could have a 20-page document and you'll see page 1 and you click start here and it'll jump you to page 17. And as you mentioned, and as most people, 80% of Americans are opening up emails on a cell phone, on a mobile phone. And, there are certain things that should be done on a laptop, and we could all debate whether you should buy airplane tickets on a laptop or a cell phone. But yeah, DocuSigns should not be done on a cell phone. But, some people are not of the means that they have a personal computer and that is their only device. And you mentioned one moment, I think it was Jerry, who had an iPhone 5 and was looking at a 20-page legalese document on an iPhone 5 and signing on the dotted line and not knowing what they were getting themselves into.
Yeah, and one other thing that I should mention is that the surgery increased the settlement value. So that was kind of the plan, right? That if you have a product in place, that your lawsuit isn't worth nearly as much as it would be if you had the product removed. So the whole idea, the whole impetus behind the scheme was let's convince people that they have to get the product removed, regardless of whether there was actually a medical need to have the product
Right.
removed.
I mean, and as you were talking about, you made a great analogy with rebar and cement. And for folks that don't know what rebar is, it's essentially metal piping, a little bit thicker than a pencil that just reinforces the concrete and prevents it from cracking. But you can't remove the rebar from the concrete once it's so. These women that had these mesh removed, there was very little their doctors could do for them afterwards. Is that correct?
Well, uh, well, yes. So done right, mesh removal can take between 7 and 8 hours. Again, remember it's supposed to form scar tissue around there. This is not something that is supposed to come out. It's supposed to go in. It's never supposed to come
Yeah.
out. So, you're removing like tiny little filaments. You've got organs all around. It's a very
Mhm.
delicate procedure. So these women were being flown down not to a hospital, but to an outpatient center in a chiropractor's office. In one instance, another outpatient center was next to a strip mall. They are taking out 5 of these meshes in a day.
Oh,
One of the doctors bragged to me that she was taking them out in 15 minutes a pop. They're taking them out 5 a day. They are then sending the women back to their hotels with their plus one, their husband, their niece, their whoever's coming with them. They spend the night at the hotel and then they ship them back at home the next day on a plane. So they've had this major surgery and then they're being flown home the next day with no doctor seeing them, in the post-op surgery period.
and what was the evaluation by a doctor before the surgery period like?
There wasn't really. So, I saw one email where Dr. Pescatori, who is still in practice, looked at a patient's medical records and marked them approved for surgery in less than a minute. There was no physical exam that was done before the surgery. There was no blood work that was done before the surgery. So, the woman would come in, they would meet with the doctor. The doctor would say, "Are you having some pains?" And again, as we age, there are pains, right? There are all kinds of pains. It could have been the mesh, it could have been something entirely different. But immediately they would say, "Okay, you're a candidate for surgery." And then they would be on the surgery operating room within a couple of hours.
Wow. Any evidence that anybody was turned away from having the surgery in these
Um,
instances?
there was so one of the doctors, Dr. Walker, did say in his deposition that he had a woman come in with no mesh, and he turned her away.
Well, there you go. Okay.
You don't have any mesh at all, then they'll turn you away, but
To be honest, Elizabeth, I'm surprised that they even turned her away. I'm sure, given the unscrupulous nature of these characters, I'm surprised they just didn't say she did and, I don't know, waved their hands in the air for 15 minutes until the surgery was complete.
well, there was one incidence where mesh had already been removed in a woman, and Dr. Hulse in Georgia did a second surgery even though the mesh had already been removed.
Wow. All right. So, yeah, that is not so far fetched, unfortunately. And so, how did this all become exposed?
Well, there are 2, heroes in the story, so lots of villains, but 2 heroes as well. One of them is kind of an unlikely hero, so she is the lawyer for a big pharma company called American Medical Systems, which was the medical device maker for one of the meshes. She got kind of a weird phone call from a doctor who was an expert for American Medical Systems and said, "Hey, I got this phone call recruiting me to remove a whole bunch of meshes in a single day. It seemed kind of weird to me. The money was really good. And I fished around, and I think there's something fishy going on. And then American medical systems started getting phone calls from doctors who were getting phone calls from women saying, "You must have given my private health insurance information to someone because
I
I am
see.
getting these phone calls." And in one case, the woman had not told a living soul, not even her husband. The only person on the planet other than her that knew she had mesh was her doctor. And she said, "How are these people getting my information?" And so Barbara started doing some digging. This is Barbara Bennis, the defense lawyer. She issued a whole bunch of subpoenas, and she started what became a 4-year caper to really dig into all of these people behind 1000 Corporate Drive and to try to figure out what was going on.
And then JR.
And then JR, yeah. So J.R. Baxter, we first meet him in his first year torts class, which is a subject close to my heart because I teach torts, I teach civil procedure. He was watching the Hot Coffee documentary, and all of a sudden it clicks for him. Here's what I want to do with my life. I want to be a tort lawyer. He had gone to a big law firm his second year as a summer associate. He hated it. He hated all the egos, they weren't for him. He is from small town Arkansas. He is from Benton, Arkansas, not to be confused with Bentonville, which is, of
Right.
course, the home of Walmart.
Yeah.
This is about 30 miles outside of Little Rock. He decides that he wants to join his dad's law firm. His dad is a solo practitioner. He's operating his firm out of their split level ranch house. You have to go in through the garage because the front door is swollen shut. And you go in into what I lovingly call the dead animal room. He's got this, 8 foot tall grizzly that's stuffed behind the desk and, all these sorts of heads on the wall. And so Jerry Plummer, who is one of the women at the heart of the book, goes in to see JR's dad, Ray Baxter. And and Ray calls JR and says, this something weird's going on. I wonder if you can help me out with this. And Jerry starts to tell her story to JR. And when she gets to the part that she had to fly down to South Florida to have it removed, JR's eyebrows get a little raised. And so he calls another guy he knows that does some of these mesh cases and says, "Hey, where did your clients have their mesh removed?" And he said, "Oh, well, here in Little Rock." And so then JR starts to dig, and he eventually comes across Barbara Bennis's paper trail. Her caper has started to wind down at that point. She's at the end of the 4 years. The judge has let her go as far as she is willing to let her go. And then JR picks up and he's representing Jerry. He's suing everyone. He's suing her former lawyers, and he's suing everybody that he can find who is affiliated with this outfit.
And how many other clients did he have in similar situations?
Yeah, so he came ultimately to represent about 180 other people. So
Wow.
I profile 3 of them. They are from very different socioeconomic classes, different parts of the country, different educational levels. Jerry has a 10th grade education. She was sitting on the bed with her granddaughter when she answered the ticking time bomb phone call on speakerphone. And her granddaughter then became an unwitting advocate saying, "Granny, I don't want you to die. Can you please go to
Mhm.
South and have this
Yeah.
surgery?" So it's Jerry, it's Barb Shepherd, who is up in Claremont, New Hampshire, and she's just this salt of the earth. She's a school bus driver. She works a second job in a plastics company. If she doesn't know how to do something, she watches a YouTube video to fix it. She installed all the plumbing in her house, just kind of an
Respect, I
amazing.
remember that.
And then Sharon Gore, who I think, many people can identify with. She is from South Carolina. She is a special education administrator. She has a master's degree. And for her, she'd been on a lot of kind of high scale vacations where, everything is done and paid for. And she was convinced that this was the device maker that was recalling the
Right.
device. And when she flew down to South Florida and they refused to take her insurance, she said, "Well, that tracks, right? These are people who are covering this. They're paying for it for me." So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, and again, this was a data breach, and so they had these call centers. The only reason they had this information is they got it by illegal means, and these women are falling for the ruse because how else would anybody know all this information that literally nobody else but they and their doctor in most of these instances know, and so their guard is down.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And, I think It's easy to sort of say, "Oh, I'd never fall prey to a scam like that," and yet when you're ki you know, for Sharon in particular, she was convinced she had been told, something the equivalent of, "You have cancer."
Yeah.
When life hangs in the balance like that and you feel like you have to act quickly or else something horrible is going to happen to you, I think any of us can fall prey to a scam, particularly when we don't have doctors that we trust or that we feel comfortable with that we can go to and say, "Hey, I got this weird phone call. What do you think?"
And this also was doing it by it was just a numbers game that they knew that they were calling, I'm sure, tens of thousands, if not more,
Over
you know.
100,000 women got these phone calls.
Wow. And how many eventually became embroiled in how many of them went to South Florida or wherever under these schemes? Do we have a sense of
Um,
that?
Never got actual admission on the numbers. My best estimate is somewhere between 1 and 5,000, but it could have been
Right.
more.
And so for each of these thousands of women, we're talking about they were on the hook for legal fees of, let's say, an average of $50,000. So, you do the math, 5,000 times 50,000, we're talking about a whole lot of money.
Yeah, and I mean, the other piece of this is that everyone is getting rich off of these women except the women.
Yeah.
So the attorneys, they take their fees off the top. The doctors are making a heck of a lot more money than they would make through insurance. You've got these middlemen that are like Blake Barber that are connecting them. The doctors are paying kickbacks to people like Blake Barber in many of these instances. And they're skirting around a number of the anti kickback laws that are embedded in Medicaid, Medicare, private insurance arrangements because there is this third party litigation funding. So the fact of funding not only brings in another entity that is getting rich off of these women, but it also means that they are kind of difficult to prosecute.
And can you describe a little bit about why the kickback scheme is illegal, and particularly in Florida?
Yeah. So, we don't want doctors paying for patients, right? That seems like it's just create the wrong kind of incentives. It's going to
Yeah.
create the exact kind of incentives that I'm writing about in this book,
Yeah.
which is to, approve people for surgery who may not ultimately need that surgery.
Yeah.
And so a number of anti kickback statutes exist at the federal level. States are spotty. So Florida at the
Mm,
time had a state statute that said that doctors couldn't pay for patients. But here in Georgia, we did not have a criminal statute in that regard. So once all of this begins to unravel, it becomes very, very difficult between the statutes of limitation, which are designed to make sure that you're not kind of forever in limbo if you've done something wrong between the statutes of limitation and the difficulty of finding kind of a federal hook
yeah.
made this very difficult to prosecute.
And I was really only person ended up at well, maybe you could talk us through how things transpired and, both on the victim side and also those that ultimately did face judgment of some sort.
Right. Well, so, I want to encourage people to read the book. I don't want to give away everything, but
Yes, yes.
says the circumstances that I describe are very much a quest for justice. So you've got Barbara Bennis who's searching for answers. You've got JR who's representing Jerry and Sharon and Barb and trying to get at the truth. You do have some criminal prosecutors who come in here, but there are a number of challenges and there are a number of legal hurdles that all of them face in that kind of quest for justice. And then you have regulatory issues. So this book raises all kinds of questions about whether we as lawyers are doing a good job regulating our own profession, whether doctors are doing a good job regulating their own profession.
Yeah.
I'll just say that there's only one of the doctors who's been involved in this scheme, and there were many, many doctors who is no longer practicing and he is still licensed to practice outside of the United States. And his license was revoked, I think, principally because he killed a woman doing a Brazilian butt lift surgery and was not licensed to do plastic surgery.
Right, and it had nothing to do with this case at all. It was just a compounding number of factors, and I was struck by the fact that although he lost his medical license, he's still able to operate his medical center, which seems preposterous.
His practice down in Orlando. and I think has employed another doctor to do yeah, again, I don't know what kind of surgeries they're doing now, but so he's still making money as a medical practitioner, just not as a doctor per se.
And a number of the folks that were able to get off, and maybe you could just describe the mechanisms that they used in terms of LLCs and shell companies and just a torturous spider web of difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, so Vince Chabra, who I mentioned at the beginning, he was the dot-com immigrant who had gone to prison for running the online pill mill. You can sort of picture him. He's got, sunglasses, he's got a shaved, glossy head. He when he was running the online pill mill, he was buying fleets of cars. I mean, BMWs, Mercedes, all the finest cars. He was outfitting mistresses in platinum toe rings. I mean, like these are kind of people. And you've got Ron LaSorsa, who was, after they sold some 14,000 mesh plaintiffs to another law firm for $40 million. And so then goes out and buys some alligator skin boots, one in pair of oxblood red and another pair in black. So, but Vince in particular had learned how to do a bunch of shell corporations. So he had a $16 million forfeiture judgment hanging over his head after the online pill mill, which meant that he didn't put anything in his name. So everything is in the name of his son, the name of his girlfriends, the name of, you name it, it's in other people's names. And as soon as, one company was kind of under the gun, then that one would go bankrupt. They'd kind of crawl out from under that bankruptcy shell and open up a new one in somebody else's name. And so, it is a very difficult enterprise both to prosecute and to collect judgments. So one of the big sort of ongoing questions is, can you collect a judgment against someone who doesn't have assets here in the United States under their name? And according to Ron, Vince has all of his assets in a number of bank accounts in Hong Kong and elsewhere.
So, in other words, his earlier legal troubles prevented him from getting in legal troubles this time around.
Well, he learned from those earlier legal troubles, right? So, he learned not to put assets in his own name. And so he has a son by the name of M. Vincent Chabra, so Michael Vincent Chabra,
Yeah,
which meant that he was able to get an American Express account under his son's name, and it looks a lot like his name.
I
Um,
see. Yeah.
yeah, so, that gave him some reprieve from kind of an all cash existence, but
Wow. I mean, do you think he named his child in that respect with that in mind?
yeah, I mean, his son was only 6 when he was running the call center, the early call centers. So, I don't think he named him with that in
Just a
mind, but
lucky break.
yeah, certainly seems to have followed in his father's footsteps. So,
Yeah,
hmm.
yeah. Ugh. And what do you see as, reform? I mean, what could be done differently? What what should be done, and what's the prognosis?
Yeah, so I would love to have a 30-second blip of like, "Hey, we do this one thing, we fix the system." I would think about it this as sort of 2 separate spheres. So one is what can you do as a person to protect yourself? And I would
Yes.
just say, knowledge is power. So, reading the book, educating yourself, and, really kind of digging into any sort of medical procedure that you're gonna have to make sure that this is what is needed for you, that these are doctors that you trust. On a systematic standpoint, there are failings at so many levels. So, we don't have universal health care. That's kind of, the first level that
Yeah.
allows for a system like this to happen. The second is we're seeing a huge curtailing of government regulation through the FDA and through, other government entities. So we think about government as being our first safeguard that we shouldn't be allowing these bad products on the market. So as those safeguards go away, that puts more pressure on the litigation system as kind of a fail-safe, right? Something
I see.
horrible has gone wrong. How do I compensate myself?
Yeah.
So if we have more robust FDA, then we're likely to have fewer bad products that come through. Assuming we have bad products that come through, then there are ways that we can try to reform the MDL system. I wrote a very boring academic book on how we fix the MDL system
And
that
what does MDL stand for?
Sorry, yes. MDL stands for multi-district litigation. So that is the way that we litigate these types of mass tort cases at the federal level. And they are essentially piled in front of a single judge for pretrial procedures, but they are very rarely remanded for trial. And so there's all kinds of things that we can do in that space to try to make it a better system for the plaintiffs. But thus far, there has really been no pressure put on reforms because the status quo benefits the big defense lawyers and big pharma. It benefits, as we talked about, the lead plaintiffs' attorneys who are making a fortune off of this. Those are kind of the repeat players. It also benefits the judges who want quick settlements. Who it hurts are kind of the one shot plaintiffs, right? The people who
Right.
don't have extended stake in the system. So I won't bore you with all the details about how we fix it, but there are a number of reforms that we can enact to try to make the mass tort system work better for consumers like us.
And if one of these victims wanted to sue on their own, what would be their recourse?
It can be really difficult. So, going and finding a J.R. Baxter is your best bet. Somebody who you can walk in your office, you can look them in the face, you can sit down and say, "Here's my story, here's what happened to me,"
Yeah.
that you can hold that attorney accountable. Now, for many people, it can be very difficult to find a lawyer who will take your case. So, one good thing about mass torts is that it allows access to the justice system, but access to justice isn't the same thing as access to courts. So, we're in the court system, we're not necessarily getting justice. But, being able to walk in, talk to your lawyer is really important. Even finding a lawyer who will ultimately refer your case to someone else, if that lawyer is somebody who can ultimately get answers from a group of lead plaintiffs' attorneys, then that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book, you said mass torts drag on for years and many lawyers work on volume, treating their clients like cans of spam in a storage bunker, necessary but to be avoided if possible. In other words, they're numbers in many instances. Yeah.
Yeah, and, even outside of this book, I've talked to a number of plaintiffs, and they almost uniformly describe feeling like they are being treated as a number on a spreadsheet, not a
Right.
person.
Which, unfortunately, they are,
Yeah, yeah.
which is the sad part. But what do you see, to end on a positive note, what do you see as something good that has happened recently or is in the process?
Yeah, well, I've talked to a number of the people in the book. So the three women, Jerry, Sharon, and Barb, I think are very happy to have their stories out there, to have their
Yeah.
stories being told, to have,
Yes.
people like us talking about them and learning from them.
Mhm.
One of the things that they told me over and over again is I this is something that's very personal to me. They're not really wanting to talk about incontinence, but if this is something that helps somebody else, then they think that this will have been worth it. Many of them are now permanently incontinent because of the way that the mesh was removed. There
Yeah.
aren't a lot of options, particularly for Jerry, who's been told multiple times, "There's nothing that we can do for you." So, I think to end on a hopeful note, it is that maybe this will put some pressure on if all of us as individuals put some pressure on Congress and the MDL system to start looking into some of these changes, then those key stakeholders who are benefiting from the status quo will actually have to change something as opposed to what they do, which is business as usual.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing this book. It really brings, the characters to light and, does justice for some of the victims. And, I'm so proud of their bravery and doing the right thing to hopefully help others. Name of the book again is The Pain Brokers: How Con Men, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. Elizabeth Burch, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes. And there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.